From the deep. Whale strandings are a mysterious phenomenon that has confounded scientists since the days of Aristotle. Many theories purport to explain these strange occurrences, and yet the mystery remains unsolved. The truth is, they beach themselves in terror. Terror of the elusive primordial thing that hunts them in the deep. Mitch took one hand off the steering wheel and pinched the bridge of his nose, allowing himself to close his eyes briefly before blinking hard and returning his attention to the road. He was dead tired. It had been a long week and a long drive down from Seattle, and there was still a long way to go. Now he was wondering whether his decision to take the 101 after Portland hadn't been an ill-advised self-indulgence. The I-5 was faster, but the I-5 was a soulless drag whose monotonous miles had, week by week, year by year, hollowed something vital out of his spirit. Mitch had always loved the coast road, those Pacific Ocean views, the endless shifting plain of the sea, its unerringly dramatic cumulus-piled skies and rolling craggy headlands. The pure wild beauty of its mercurial majesty imparted a restorative quality that could be found nowhere else. It reminded him that there was a real world out there, a tangible world of substance and consequence. It reminded him that he himself was real and alive, not just another meat battery plugged into the money machine. Mitch sighed at that, sighed and thought of Camille. He wished he had a cigarette, wished he hadn't quit smoking a decade before. That was when he noticed them. Why they caught his eye, he couldn't afterwards recall. 4 black shapes lying side by side on the beach, just beyond the reach of the lapping surf. They looked tiny at this distance, and sleek with a glistening wet sheen. He did a double take, half lost as he had been in thoughts of her. When he looked again, it was clear that they were whales. Sperm whales, he could tell by the shape, by that characteristically blunt, squared-off nose. Beached whales were, as far as he knew, something of an unexplained phenomena, and a rare one at that. Mitch was intrigued. The road was empty along this remote stretch, and a mile or so further on, he drew the Ford Explorer to a stop at the crumbling edge of the asphalt. Within a few minutes, he was down on the beach, his shoes sinking into damp sand, a fresh, blustery wind tousling his hair and buffeting about his ears. The beach about him slick with brine as the tide ebbed away. Waves waxed and waned along the shoreline in a languid litany. Far out, the broad tract of the grey sea lay quiet beneath the lowering sky that dimmed serenely as the ember of the setting sun touched the rim of the Pacific. It was dusk by the time he reached them, 4 hulks lying forlornly on the sodden sand, their bodies relaxed as though in repose, but they were dead. No breath of life moved the sleek giants. Each lay silent and unnervingly still. It was a sad sight, he thought, and it moved him to see such magnificent beings, creatures of vigour and intelligence, so wantonly diminished. Why were they here, he wondered, frowning. Why would they willingly strand themselves on this desolate beach when they had the whole ocean to explore? Why have you stranded yourself, he thought reprovingly. Stranded within the artificial constraints of a life lived shallowly, in a job you loathe. Why have you beached yourself in the stifling confines of that office in Seattle, a periodic castaway from home and spouse, robotically performing an abstract and ultimately futile function, with no deeper meaning than the accruing of currency, for the tenuous palliative of a monthly paycheck, dental, healthcare, and an adequate, if modest, 401k. Was there much of a difference, he wondered? Just why these beasts had stranded themselves he couldn't for the moment tell, but he knew what had driven his own metaphorical beaching, and that had been fear. Not the raw corporeal fear of the wild and of nature. No, his fear had been far more insidious. His was a psychological cowardice, a reticence that had held him back all these years, that had kept him in check, that urged him to play it safe. In that moment, Mitch felt a deep sense of empathy for those 4 departed leviathans with whom he shared that deserted beach. He felt a kinship in futility, that at once comforted and depressed him. These dark ruminations were interrupted by an unexpected voice at his shoulder.
Oh my god, are they dead?
The newcomer was a woman, in late middle age, but with that perennial youthfulness and vibrancy emblematic of the Californian native. She went on without catching his gaze.
Why do you think they do it? Beach themselves, I mean.
She looked at him then, the first gleam of tears gathering on her lower lids. He shrugged, reluctant to theorize on the subject, doubtful of the validity of such speculations, coloured as they must be by his discontented mood.
Maybe they just gave up. Maybe the struggle just wore them down, and this seemed like the right decision.
She eyed him dubiously, her lips tightening, and she shook her head.
It's such a waste.
Mitch nodded in silent agreement, his gaze wandering out to sea.
It's a tragedy.
She moved off then, running her palm across the dark flank of the nearest creature in mute communion. Across the beach, more were coming now, in ones and twos, drawn by the sorrowful spectacle of the grounded pod. Soon, a scattered crowd of sightseers garnished the vicinity of the whales, talking in huddled groups and taking selfies in the fading light. Mitch retreated. His silent rapport with the whales had been spoiled by the coming of the crowd. He resented their intrusion, for with their arrival, that spell of quiet reflection and insight had been broken. This chance finding, his unexpected affinity with these sorry creatures, had pried something open inside him, something that had lain hidden for too long. This fresh objectivity had affected his mood, rendering him uncharacteristically sensitive and withdrawn. The crowd irritated him, and he'd resolved to return to the truck and move on, when his plodding retreat up the beach was arrested by a peculiar rushing sound coming from the sea, an unexpected surging that rose above the quiet muttering of the crowd and the languid folding of the waves at the margin of the water. Gazing far out to sea, he was bemused to discover a peculiar bulge distorting the flat grey expanse. He watched, intrigued and with growing fascination, as it swelled enigmatically into a pronounced hump, sleek with cascading foam. With the passage of a minute or so, it grew, rising like a freshly formed island surging up out of the deep. Yet the thing itself was visibly translucent, even in the grey of dusk, and it formed a smooth, swooping arc against the distant clouds banked up along the horizon.
What is that?
Someone asked, doubtfully, and a dubious rumble of voices rippled through the crowd at the sight of this strange aberration. At that moment, an impossible notion struck him, that the water itself was alive and animated, taking shape. But he knew that such a thing could not be, and he cast these speculations from his mind derisively. Far beyond the breakers, seawater cascaded from the arching flanks of that great something, with a sustained, distant roar as it rose higher still, even as they watched. Now it was seen to be advancing on the beach, a wrinkled bow wave crested with foam driving ahead of it. As it bore on, the great, jelly-like hull rose higher, an impossible bulk bellying up out of the surf, looming ponderously, obscuring, with an oddly hypnotic mode of undulating refraction, a full quadrant of the greying sky. The thing was huge, monstrous, an improbable upwelling of quavering translucency whose shifting surface writhed oddly in the failing light. It was, Mitch observed, in a moment of detachment, reminiscent of a film of oil swirling and separating of its own accord on the surface of a puddle of water. It was impossible to ascertain just how big it was, there being no frame of reference by which to gauge it, but he knew it was huge, mountainous in fact. He suspected that its great gelatinous bulk would have dwarfed the biggest ship that ever sailed. The crowd stood, irresolute, transfixed by the sight of it. There was a low murmur of speculation, followed at length by a thin, self-conscious scream. But no one moved. The great head appeared then, surging out of the sea in a terrific welter of foam. At least, Mitch thought, it was most likely its head, if it had one, though he couldn't be certain of the thing's anatomy, so alien was it to anything known. There were eyes in it anyway, located in a dense cluster at the centre of what Mitch took to be its brow. Then came a terrific outpouring of great glassy tentacles, spilling out from beneath that blank alien face. Like a host of titanic serpents, they came thrashing through the surf, and Mitch felt the ground shift beneath his feet with the sudden impact, as the great translucent mass of them spilled through the lapping surf at the shore, and out onto the beach itself. The slimmest of them was perhaps the thickness of a subway carriage, and they came on at the pace of a speeding train, driving up the beach, questing blindly toward the huddled carcasses of the beached whales. That the scattered crowd of onlookers fell victim to those rushing feelers as they burst monstrously among them was merely coincidental. The Titan thing was oblivious to their presence, wholly focused as it was on its habitual prey. Mitch was among them, on the fringes of the group. Frightened as he was, he yet had the prescience of mind to flee, somehow escaping the coercive mesmerism that held sway over the rest. One of those colossal ducts thrashed past him like a runaway train as he broke across the beach, its sticky surface adorned with screaming men and women. By some whim of the monster, the shaft shifted course, its vast bulk rolling over, callously crushing several of its helpless passengers beneath its descending flank as it snaked toward him. In a split second it was on him, and there was nothing he could do as the monstrous thing overtook him. The slick surface rippled and roughened at the point nearest him into a cluster of rounded nodules and developed rapidly into a myriad groping projections that reached out and clung to his back as he fled. The great limb rolled again at that, and Mitch was carried up and up with its rolling turn, the bloody ruin of another wretched victim smeared beside him on its glistening flank. There was an odd sensation of rushing water within the fabric of the thing, and Mitch realised, in one of those bizarre moments of calmness and clarity that sometimes descends in the midst of dire peril, that the thing was swollen with seawater, that somehow seawater flowed within it. Afterwards, Mitch was never quite certain what happened next. The memory of those moments was lost to him, blotted out perhaps by the terror and helplessness of his plight. Whether through luck or frantic effort, at some point he managed to disengage himself, struggling free of his jacket, leaving it stuck fast to the thing's side, and dropping heavily onto the furrowed sand far below as the great duct withdrew. Unexpectedly free, he whirled and bolted up the beach, despite the sharp pain at his ankle. Heading toward the road and the sanctuary of the Ford parked quietly at the shoulder, Mitch didn't dare look back until he'd lost himself among the rocks and the boulders fringing the beach. There he paused to catch his breath and appraise the situation. By now the thing, whatever that thing was retreating back to the sea, and, terrorized and dumbfounded, he watched its colossal bulk gliding ponderously beneath the waves. Only when it was gone did his faculties return. When he looked, the whales were gone, and so were the people. No one remained of that ill-fated crowd save Mitch himself. There was nothing on that desolate stretch of sand to attest to their presence. All that remained was a striking confusion of deep furrows that the high tide would erase forever during the course of the coming night. Mitch scrambled to his waiting car, locking the doors fretfully as he sat panting and shaking in the driver's seat, wishing to God he had a cigarette. He couldn't make sense of what he'd seen, what he'd experienced. All he knew was that he had stared a cryptic death in the face, and somehow, against all the odds, he had survived. Sitting there, along that darkened stretch of highway, he knew that Providence had granted him a reprieve, and that every day forever after would be a gift. A gift he swore he would no longer fritter away foolishly, in fear and doubt and trepidation, as he had done so many times before. You have been listening to From the Deep, Episode 10 of Savage Bites. If you like this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And I'd really appreciate it if you'd take the time to share a link to the story and to the channel with any of your friends who happen to be horror fans or into horror narration or creepypasta. The idea for this story was born out of some research I was doing online into the whale stranding phenomenon. I thought it was just like a really interesting thing, and just wondered how that phenomena could be turned into a horror story, so I came up with the idea of this weird gelatinous monster that hunts whales and has never been detected by science because its body is comprised almost exclusively of seawater and therefore is basically invisible to sonar. It's a conceit, of course, and perhaps an unrealistic one, but I thought it was quite a fun thing to have in a story, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much for listening, and look out for the next episode.